And the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with the chariots and his troops, to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah, "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendant of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zananim near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River with all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword, not a man was left. Sisera meanwhile fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin king of Hazor and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said, "please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day God subdued Jabin king of Canaan before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin king of Canaan until they destroyed him. Well, today, with the world of social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, podcasting and the like, pop culture has actually coined a new phrase to describe a person with significant cultural influence. That word, of course, is influencer. So what is an influencer? Well, an influencer is really any person with a sizable social media presence and also with commercial marketability. An influencer is a person with the power to impact the moral landscape, the values, the political choices, the morality, the purchasing behaviors and decisions of people in the community. They are usually celebrities, sporting professionals, politicians, activists, authors, media personalities, entrepreneurs, and even philanthropists. Whereas 50 years ago, celebrities were primarily influential because of what they did on the big screen or what they did in their profession. They were seen as glamorous, and they could market a certain lifestyle and products to the public. This is how mass marketing took off. But very few people actually knew about the personal opinions of celebrities and sporting professionals. Whereas today, people care about the cultural footprint of celebrities and influencers. They care about how they think and how they feel. They care about their political thoughts. They care about how they see the world around them. So whereas 50 years ago, an influential person like, say, the former First Lady Jackie Kennedy, she was primarily influential because she was fashionable. Women wanted to dress like her. Well, today instead, you have people like Michelle Obama, Prince Harry, Meghan Markle and the like, who are signing massive podcasting and commercial deals on platforms like Amazon, Netflix, and Spotify, all to share their thoughts, their personal, private opinions on politics, the environment, Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, the war in the Ukraine, and the world in general. So today, influencers don't just need to be good at their public form of entertainment. No, today, they need to inspire people. They need to be the cultural light. So who are the most influential people in 2022? Who are the influencers? Well, today, they are people like Cristiano Ronaldo, Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, Selena Gomez, Kylie Jenner, Joe Rogan, Taylor Swift, Dwayne Johnson, Kim Kardashian, Ben Shapiro, Rihanna, and Katy Perry, just to name a few. Well, today, as we continue our series, Moving Forward with Faithfulness, we are looking at the story of a great influencer. We are looking at one of the great influencers of history. We're looking at a lady who was the most influential figure of her generation. We're looking at the story of a lady who influenced a generation of unfaithful Israelites and turned them back to the Lord through her courage and her influence. We're looking at the story of Deborah. Deborah was an incredibly influential leader in the nation of Israel. Her ministry came at a time where the people of God were oppressed by a foreign ruler and their hearts had turned away from God. And through her courage and her faithfulness, her passion, her conviction and her boldness, she influenced a generation of people to take seriously their walk with God. But to understand the story of Deborah, the book of Judges details her story in 2 chapters, chapters 4 and chapters 5 of the book of Judges. And I encourage you to go away and read those chapters. But to understand her story, we need to understand a bit of background. We need to set the context. You see, Deborah's life, her ministry took place during a period of Israel's history known as the Judges. You see, we know that the nation of Israel were brought out of bondage, out of the land of slavery, out of the land of the Egyptians through their servant of God, Moses. And they were brought into the promised land and conquered the nations around them through the leadership of Joshua. But then for several hundred years, the people's loyalty to God, their deliverer, wavered. And they turned their hearts and their attention to the gods of the nations around them. And as a result, they ended up being conquered by some of the nations around them. And God delivered them through a series of military leaders, people known as judges. Now, the nation of Israel at this time didn't have one central king or one central government. Instead, they had leaders who God rose up and who were appointed, known as judges. And it was the responsibility of these judges to run the country and to run the nation. But most importantly, to be spiritual leaders who turned the hearts of the people back to their God when the people walked away. And Deborah came up during a time of Israel's history where the people had walked away from God. They had walked away from God and they had found themselves oppressed by a wicked foreign king whose name was Jabin. Now, Jabin had an army more powerful than the nation of Israel. He had an army with more sophisticated technology than the nation of Israel. You see, the Iron Age had just dawned, and he had iron chariots, which meant that he was able to oppress the nation of Israel. And he set up his palace in the northern part of Israel's border as a reminder that he was their ruler, he was their king, and he was their oppressor. And he instructed one of his chief commanders, a man whose name was Sisera. He instructed him to set up his army, to set up
his troops right within the heart of Israel's nation and right within their borders as a way of showing the people that he was their superior and that they dared not challenge his superior technology and military might. And this is what it says about him. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. So Deborah came at a time when the people of God were being oppressed by this foreign ruler and they had turned their hearts away from God. And Deborah was able to inspire a generation to cry back to the Lord for help. And it was through her military strategy, through the way that God spoke to her, that she influenced the nation of Israel and the nation of Israel's commanders. And they overcame their great oppressor. But today, as we talk about being people of influence, we remember that we are called to influence a generation of people whose hearts are far away from God. We are called to be influencers, to bring their hearts and to turn their hearts back to the true and the living God, to turn their hearts away from their immorality, away from their sin, to the risen King Jesus. And just like Deborah, we, through our courage, our boldness, and our passion, we will lead a generation of people back into right relationships with the risen King Jesus. But as we talk about this important concept of being an influencer, I want to share with you just 3 practical lessons of application here today. And the first is this. You see, influencers are selective about who they subscribe to. Influencers are selective about who they subscribe to. I think you would agree with me that we live in a world, in a culture which is just saturated with ideas and opinions. You know, because of social media, because of the internet, these days anybody with a smartphone, anybody with a tablet can film themselves, they can record their voice and put their ideas, their beliefs and their opinions online. The world is just filled with all sorts of information, all sorts of ideas about religion, about God, about politics, about all sorts of things. Any sort of hot topical issue in the world, the internet is just saturated with ideas. Now, influencers are discerning people. They are people that test these ideas and they don't allow ideas to influence them if those ideas are wrong or if they're negative. And this is one of the critical things about Deborah. Deborah was an influencer who was selective about what she listened to. You see, the mistake that the nation of Israel made during this part of its history was that they allowed themselves to be influenced by the pagan nations around them. They allowed themselves to follow the ideas, the cultural norms, the beliefs, the religious opinions. They allowed themselves to follow the ideas of the culture and the surrounding nations around them. You see, this is what God had instructed his people not to do before they entered the land. He instructed them not to listen to the culture around them, but to allow their idea, their culture, their worldview to be shaped only by what he had taught them when he had liberated them out of Egypt, when he had given them the scriptures. He taught them to be influenced by that and not the stories of the pagan cultures around them. This is what Deuteronomy says, that do not fall into the trap of following their customs and worshipping their gods. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how do these nations worship their gods? I want to follow their examples. You see, if you want to be an influencer, it's important that you are selective about who you listen to online, what kind of podcasts you listen to, what kind of television shows you watch, what kind of media outlets you listen to. You must be selective. You can't just take in all the information of the culture around you, but instead look at the world through the lens of the gospel. Look at the world through the lens of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Look at the world through the lens of the eternal relationship you have with God. Don't just allow your thoughts to be shaped by the culture around you. This was the mistake that God's people had, that Deborah had to overcome. She had to overcome a generation of people that had walked away from God, not because they didn't have the information that God wanted them to have by way of the scriptures. No, it was instead because they had allowed themselves to be influenced by the culture around them. If you and I are not careful about who we listen to, if we're not careful about the types of people we follow online, if we're not careful about the types of podcasts we listen to, or the types of news that we watch, or the types of comments that we read on the internet, if we're not selective about the type of company that we keep, the type of friends that we have, then we will be influenced and we will walk as the culture walks. That was the mistake that the nation of Israel made. And that's what made Deborah such an influential figure, is that she was selective about what she allowed to influence her. Instead of looking to the culture around her, she listened only to the voice of God, and that drove her, that influenced her. But the second thing about influences is that influences are infectious. Influences are infectious. You know, we're in the COVID world and we're talking about not spreading the virus. But what about spreading great leadership? What about spreading passionate disciples who are passionate, courageous, and bold? That is the type of influencer that Deborah was. She was the type of influencer who her faith, her courage, and her boldness when it came to the task God had encouraged her and challenged her with, she was infectious. She was so infectious that even though she was a woman, even though she wasn't leading the military, Israel's commander Barak entrusted the army to her and the plans that God had given to her. This is what the text says. Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go with you. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Certainly, I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." You know, this is what makes Deborah such an inspirational leader. That even though she was a woman, her leadership style was infectious. Her courage, her boldness, and her faithfulness to the Lord was infectious. So much so that the commander of Israel's army, Barak, gave her the responsibility, entrusted her with the task of communicating God's battle plan in order to liberate his people from their oppressors. And this is the type of people we have to be. This is the type of courageous, bold, passionate people of God we have to be. When we are faithful to God, that will be infectious to other people. People around us will see our passion for God, our commitment to serving, our fire, our resilience, and they will be drawn to us as leaders. That's what made Deborah a courageous leader. You see, others were looking at their circumstances. Others in the army were looking at the fact that Jabin and his commander, Sisera, had superior technology. They had their iron chariots. That's what made them supreme. That's the reason why they were oppressing the Israelites. They looked to their outside situation, whereas Deborah looked to the power and the might of her God. And what I love about the story of Deborah is the military tactics, because God instructs Deborah to move the army onto the mountain, onto the great mountain. And why does he do this? He does this because, simply put, it is brilliant military tactics. The chariots drawn by the horses are ineffective when they've got to go up a mountain to fight the battle. Chariots need a flat plain. And that's what God instructed Deborah. And Deborah passed that information down to the military commander Barak and to his troops. That where we're fighting the battle, the enemy does not have the strategic advantage. And Deborah trusted God and trusted his military tactics. And that style of leadership was infectious. That's the type of people we have to be. We have to be influencers who don't look to the culture around us, but look to the battle plans that God has drawn up for us. We look to the gospel message, which is our foundation, and we influence the world to come back to God. Those sorts of leaders are infectious. That sort of leadership style is infectious. That sort of passion is the type of leadership that people are drawn to. Faithful leadership. You know, Deborah reminds me a lot of Winston Churchill. You see, Winston Churchill was the great military leader of the Second World War, Britain's Prime Minister. And you know, during days where people were trying to appease the Nazis, in a time where people were worried about the superior military might of Hitler and the Nazis, what did Winston Churchill do? He challenged a generation. He challenged the British people not to give up. He challenged them to fight in the streets, to fight on the beaches, to fight in the air, and to never surrender, to never give in to tyranny. And through his rallying speeches, he rallied the parliament. He rallied and he inspired the people. That was the type of leader who Deborah was. That was the type of leader that the gospel movement needs today. Passionate and infectious people who will influence the world and never surrender. But the third important truth about influencers is that influencers stand up to the deception of their culture. Influencers stand up to the deception of their culture. And this is our most controversial point here today. And I think you and I can agree that our culture is on a downward spiral. We're sliding down the moral landscape. We have walked away from God just like the people of God had walked away from them. Our culture has turned to idols. Our culture has turned to sexual pleasure and gratification. Our culture has turned to immorality. People are running after money. People are chasing after the wrong things. And it is in this type of culture that we preach Christ crucified. It's in this type of culture that we preach the risen Lord Jesus. It is in this type of culture that we are calling people to turn from their sins, that we are trying to influence a generation of people that despise God and have rejected God. And this is where we need influencers, leaders like Deborah, who are going to stand up and confront the deception of their culture. Leaders who will see the immoral spiral and confront that deception. You see, today, our young people are being deceived. They are being turned away from God, turned to all sorts of deception. And we need courageous influencers who are going to challenge the deception of their day. What was the deception of Deborah's day? Well, it was King Jabin and his commander, Sisera, who were deceiving the nation of Israel, causing them to worship foreign gods, causing them to believe that he was their king. He was their oppressor. But what did Deborah do? She challenged this deception. She rallied the army, so much so that Jabin and Sisera were routed by the power of God. And their commander, Sisera, fled. He fled away and he tried to flee to somebody who he thought was his ally. And he eventually had a tent peg driven through his skull and he was killed in the most horrific of fashion. So horrific that this is not a Sunday school story. But what are you and I doing as influencers? We are not allowing ourselves to be deceived by this culture. We're not allowing ourselves to be deceived by the messages that our society is telling us. Messages like all roads lead to God. Messages like it doesn't matter what you do. Just be yourself. Believe whatever you want to believe about your gender. Believe whatever you want to believe about your sexual orientation. This is deception. And we need influencers who are going to stand up to the deception in their culture. The Bible says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, His pleasing and perfect will. We live in a society where our culture is trying to deceive us. And Isaiah said it like this: woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. We live in a culture which has taken things that we once knew to be wrong, and now it's selling it to us as if it is light, as if it is true, as if it is good. And we need influencers who are going to stand toe to toe with the wickedness that is in this society and challenge it to turn society on its head, just like the first followers of Jesus did when they walked into the pagan temples, where they stood in front of emperors and they challenged them to turn away from their foreign gods, from their foreign idols, and to turn to light, to turn to the risen King Jesus. You see, that's what influencers do. They see deception in the culture and they turn that deception on its head. They educate people to walk away from the deception into the light. And can I close with just this point of addressing this problem in our society? And what I say now is going to be very controversial, so I forewarn you. That the most influential author, that if we were to assess and to try to determine who has been the most influential author of the last 20 odd years, without question we would have to say that it's been J.K. Rowling, the writer of the Harry Potter series. Now, J.K. Rowling, it's been said of her that she's influenced a generation of young people to get back into reading, to get back into literature. For the last 2 years, J.K. Rowling has become somewhat of a cultural pariah. She's had publishers reject her books. She's had her books taken out of libraries. She's had her books taken out of reading lists in schools. Why is it that this once great and well-respected author who's made billions of dollars and who's spun off a successful film franchise, why is it that all of these things have happened to her? Well, it's very simple. It's because in the last 2 years, she's incurred the wrath of people from the LGBTIQA plus community. Now, what has she done to make such a powerful enemy? Well, it's very simple. She has challenged the deception of this culture, which has tried to deny the fact that there are two genders. She has challenged the fact that our culture today, that young people today are being taught that there's a spectrum when it comes to biological sex. I told you this would be controversial. She's challenged the lies that people in our culture are trying to feed young children, that there are multiple genders. The reality is that it doesn't matter how you look at it, whether you look at it through anthropology, through the lens of history, whether you look at it through the lens of science, whether you look at it through chromosomes, biology, the reproductive gametes, it doesn't matter how you look at it, or even if you look at it through simple anatomy. There are only two sexes, male and female. What the Creator God said in the beginning, male and female, He made them. Today, our culture is trying to deceive a generation of young people who do not know better. And J.K. Rowling has incurred the wrath of the culture because she has said what we all know, that biological sex matters, that women matter and their rights matter. Influencers do not care about public perception. They care about what is true. If you and I are going to be influencers, we can't care about what backlash comes our way. If we are going to challenge the deception that is in this society, deception that Satan is trying to lead people down, we must not be afraid of the backlash that comes with it. That's part of what it means to be a gospel influencer. That's part of what it means to influence our culture, to put their trust in Jesus, to repent of their sins and put their trust in Jesus. The biggest mistake that the nation of Israel made was this. It says that in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what seemed right in his own eyes. Instead of looking to the truth, instead of looking to God, they compromised their values and they allowed themselves to be influenced by the pagan culture around them. They had no king. But you and I have a king. We have a king. That king is Jesus, who died for our sins at Calvary and who 3 days later walked out of the grave, which means we are influenced by Him, by His word and His Spirit alone. We are not influenced by this culture. And He is challenging us. He is calling up a generation of young people who He is raising up, not to be influenced by the society, but to be influencers who will challenge the status quo, who will challenge the immorality in this society, and who will call people back to the true and the living God, just like Deborah did.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've been encouraged. We've been so happy to be with you, and we encourage you to join us next week, same time, same place, for worshiping our great and wonderful God. Bye-bye.